Abdul El-Sayed is officially the Democratic nominee for Senate in Michigan. The former health director and progressive candidate narrowly defeated moderate Congresswoman Haley Stevens by about 1 percentage point. It was a record turnout for the state, with 1.5 million ballots counted. That's the most in recent history. It also marks a big win for progressives who saw victories up and down the ballot in Michigan, including in a House race in the Detroit area. But now El-Sayed faces the challenge of having to unite the Democratic Party with roughly 90 days to go until November. He'll have to find ways to attract Stevens supporters in places like Oakland County, home to the state's largest Jewish population, as well as Wayne and Saginaw counties that have the biggest share of black voters. He had this message for Michiganders yesterday.
So if you supported me or you did not support me, if you voted for Vice President Harris in 2024 or you're voted for Donald Trump, if you believe like me that you ought to be able to afford your groceries, if you believe like me that a government of the people, by the people, and for the people is our birthright in this country, if you believe like me that we have a responsibility to stand up and walk with our union so that everybody has collective bargaining rights in this country, if you believe like me that you ought to have the guarantee of good health care in this country without some corporation trying to tell you what you cannot have and should not fight for, I hope that you'll join this movement now.
Now, work has already begun to mend fences, with Stevens posting to social media that she had spoken with El-Sayed and offered her support as he now goes on to face former Republican Congressman Mike Rogers. Rogers, who already has a $45 million commitment from the Republican Senate Leadership Fund, reacted in a statement yesterday, writing, "Abdul doesn't represent a vision for the future. He's leading a movement grounded in ideological fascism." Meanwhile, outgoing Democratic Senator Gary Peters of Michigan, who had endorsed Congresswoman Stevens for his seat, congratulated El-Sayed on his victory and then said this to reporters yesterday.
So I knew it would be very tight, which it certainly was. But now we have to come together and understand that whatever differences existed between Haley Stevens and Abdul, those are very small compared to the difference between Abdul and Mike Rogers. And we're going to make sure that our Democratic Party comes together in Michigan and reach out to independent voters to win the race. Michigan is very diverse. We've seen it before. We know Bernie Sanders won over Hillary Clinton in a previous primary, so it's a very diverse state. But the ultimate test is a general election, and we're going to make sure we win that.
She's been there for all of it and still will be. MS Now chief political reporter Chris Jansing, my very, very past midnight friend in Michigan.
Yes, 1:30 we were standing outside the hotel saying we survived.
Followers on social media get the best content, and Chris's is great. But I have to say, I think when I hear Gary Peters talk about the fact that Bernie Sanders did well in Michigan in 2016, we saw other pockets of progressivism in 2020 and 2024. I mean, talk about how this has really been, I think, a continuation for the progressive movement that is finally now amounting to El-Sayed winning, albeit by a tight margin. I imagine you've just been working the phones and talking about what the ripple effects are. So how is this landing?
So I think among the progressive community, there is rejoicing.
Yes.
They see this as a defining moment. I might call it more of a wake-up call for the Democratic Party. The defining moment will come in November. But there's no doubt that with the kind of money that went up against Abdul El-Sayed, the kind of negative advertising that, as he acknowledged, allowed the other side to define him before he could define himself. That's really part of the key central discussion that he's having as part of his campaign, which is all the outside money that's coming in. The money that's going to come, will he be able to compete with that? You mentioned the $45 million from the Senate GOP campaign group. How much money will AIPAC put into this? They've got an $80 million stockpile, according to the latest FEC filing. So this is going to be another test for the progressive movement and messaging versus the big money and corporate dollars on the other side that he's fighting against.
We're also just going to be hearing so much about the need to unify. I mean, I was already sick of the word, and voters hadn't even decided the results of the election yet. And so what I was thinking about and hearing, frankly, was that no matter if it was Stevens or El-Sayed, both were going to have some healing work to do. And when you you see the way that he started to do that yesterday? He had Mallory McMorrow next to him, obviously the third leg of that what once was a three-way primary, standing next to him as he made that pivot to day one of the general. I mean, what did you hear in the way that he's trying to do that? He did speak directly to Jewish voters.
He did. He addressed them very specifically. He has spoken frequently and fervently against anti-Semitism, but his decision to never ever go away from, which was a central core tenet from the very beginning, that he did not want money to go into the effort in Israel that funds their military. He has not backed off of that, will not back off of that, which has caused, frankly, a ton of AIPAC money to come in. You already heard what President Trump said. He's a communist loser who hates Jews and Israel. Yeah. But I think, you know, it does raise a larger question, both in the Jewish community and there's another question in the black community, right, about whether he can coalesce people. So when he says, in a very folksy way, when we walk out the house, we stand united, there's a lot of work that's going to have to go on beyond that. And of course, there's going to be a breakfast, there's going to be a rally, a Democratic unity. We have to see how that comes together with a headliner of Pete Buttigieg, who lives in Michigan.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's a lot of attention has been paid to what this Thursday breakfast is going to be. So in a few hours after it happens, call us and let us know how it went. I think there was also the view that this primary was going to tell us something about the future of the Democratic Party. The way that I came away from it, and you and I were talking about this before we came out here, was, okay, you know, 46 and 47% of the electorate on either side think that they have a vision, which is to say, they don't know what they want the North Star of the party to be. And I wonder what you saw in the results.
Yeah, I think he harnessed the frustration of the establishment, harnessed the frustration against Donald Trump. And he did that very effectively. He is a gifted political communicator. There's no doubt about that. I think the other thing that the dismissal by his opponent, Mike Rogers, that this is a referendum on Donald Trump is wishful thinking, right? Yeah. When you look at the lack of popularity for Donald Trump there, but also just look at the way that they've been addressing the issues very specifically that Donald Trump has gotten behind. Not just money in politics, but money in your pocket. He's done a great job of connecting corporate donations to the reason that many people feel that they are hurting, that their interests are not being served by members of Congress. And I'm going to be watching very carefully what happens on Tuesday with Francesca Hong, who is the Democrat who is running in Wisconsin, because when I was talking to progressive leaders over the course of the last several weeks, they believe that what happened, the impetus that comes now from the win by El Sayed can help her. People in Wisconsin can look in the way they looked at Zohran Mamdani, right? I think Zohran Mamdani obviously helped Abdul El Sayed by saying, yes, someone who is this progressive can indeed win. So now in Wisconsin, they can say, oh, this is something that is becoming, for lack of a better phrase, more mainstream, more acceptable, and potentially more winnable.
I think that's right. They're all writing chapters in the book of can progressives be electable, because that has always been the barrier for these folks who are coming from outside the Democratic mainstream that they've been trying to show proof of purchase on. And you're doing my job for me, because after Michigan, Democrats are turning to the next battleground race that could help determine the future of the party. And that is Wisconsin, where there are 4 Democratic candidates looking to replace the outgoing governor, Tony Evers. Milwaukee County Executive David Crowley has been endorsed by the governor, but right now the frontrunner in the race is Democratic Socialist and State Representative Francesca Hong. Crowley told the Associated Press yesterday that Abdul El Sayed's slim margin of victory in Michigan gives him a little bit of hope, and that he's going to focus on undecided voters over the next few days. Hong, meanwhile, has been facing growing questions about past social media posts where she called for things like canceling Thanksgiving. She now says it's her favorite holiday, disparaged Valentine's Day, and repeatedly called for defunding the police. In recent days, she's backtracked and clarified, but that has been the game that Hong has been forced to play as she has become the front runner in this race, Chris, and really been subject to more scrutiny. And we had David Crowley on this show when he jumped back in the race. And I said, well, the fear is that you're getting in because you're worried about the Democratic Socialist candidate. And he basically was like, no, voters are going to make their own decision. But that is a fear within the Democratic establishment or the folks that are backed up by establishment figures, in this case, like Crowley.
Challenging business as usual. And again, if you're looking for another through line between Abdul El-Sayed and Francesca Hong, and I had a not short interview with her after the debate in Wisconsin. She, like him, does not back off on her policies. She may back off a little bit on Thanksgiving and say she was joking. And actually, her past career as first a dishwasher and then a chef has seemed to help her. A lot of people relate to that. The working class voters who really like her relate to that. But there is a focus that they have on their core issues. And I think that's the problem that so many people have. And for example, if we go back to the El-Sayed race, he's going to go after Mike against his opponent, because Mike Rogers is somebody who started out by saying Joe Biden won the 2020 race. And then Donald Trump, who found his superpower in election denialism with a lot of his base, suddenly wavered on that. And so I think for a lot of voters, at least the voters I've talked to across 5-6 battleground states now, including Wisconsin and Michigan, they want people who start with a position, stay with a position, and are fighting, they believe, for their core interests, which don't involve Donald Trump. And many of those folks who are supported by Donald Trump may back away from him and not say his name anymore. But the fact is, he's going to continue to be a central core issue in this campaign.
I think you just bring up the most important word, both in the Michigan primary and going forward, which is the word fight. That is essential to Democratic voters.